What if the real reason behind Ferrari's decades-long struggle was never about car performance, but about who they chose to listen to? After Lewis Jamiltón quietly exposed an internal culture of favoritism, selective data use, and whispered sabotage, the question is no longer whether he can adapt to Ferrari, but whether Ferrari can survive the truth he uncovered. For years, the team placed blind trust in Leclerc, shaping the car, the strategy, and even the narrative around him. But now, with Jamilton's forensic approach and unshakable poise, he has lifted the curtain on practices that would shake any elite organization to its core. Was it incompetence? Was it protectionism? Or was it something worse, an institutional fear of change disguised as loyalty? One thing is certain: Lewis Jamiltón did not just join Ferrari, he is rebuilding it from the inside out. And in doing so, he has revealed a truth few dared to voice. Sometimes, the biggest enemy of progress is not the rival team, but your own garage. When Lewis Jamiltón arrived at Ferrari, he did so not with naive hope, but with seasoned awareness. Over a decade of navigating team dynamics, political structures, and high-stakes paddock diplomacy had sharpened his instincts far beyond what telemetry could capture. He knew that performance on track was only half the battle. The real story often unfolded in whispered meetings, internal reports, and the subtle choices of race engineers whose influence extended far beyond a radio call. So when a series of small discrepancies began stacking up during early season development, Jamilton's concern did not stem from paranoia, but from pattern recognition. At first, it was timing. The delivery of updated components to his side of the garage always lagged slightly behind those of Leclerc. It was explained away as coincidence, logistics, whether delays or supplier constraints. But the frequency of such delays, and their precision in always favoring one driver, planted a seed of doubt. Then came the strategy briefings. His input, though thoughtful and data-backed, would often be considered but never implemented. On paper, everything looked fair. But in practice, something was off. The unity that Ferrari publicly preached seemed increasingly like a script designed to pacify, rather than inform. It was during a post-session debrief in Maranello that Jamilton's suspicions began to focus on one specific individual: his own race engineer. A figure praised publicly for professionalism and calm, but whose private tone often swayed between passive and dismissive. In subtle ways, strategic cues were delivered late, tire suggestions were phrased with uncertainty, and setup changes were always routed through broader committees rather than direct communication. For a driver who thrived on precision, these delays were not just inconvenient, they were deeply compromising. Rather than make accusations, Jamiltón did what he had always done best: he investigated. Quietly, carefully, he began cross-referencing radio logs from previous sessions with timing data. He requested access to engineering summaries shared between both sides of the garage. What he found was not proof of sabotage, but an undeniable pattern of asymmetry. His engineer had been consistently more responsive and engaged during Leclerc's sessions, even during shared simulation runs. Briefing notes were richer, strategy feedback was more dynamic, and post-analysis adjustments happened faster. It was favoritism disguised as standard procedure. As Lewis Jamiltón dug deeper into the internal operations of his engineering team, it became evident that what he was witnessing was not a deliberate act of sabotage, but a systemic bias, one rooted in years of embedded loyalty and unspoken favoritism. The engineer in question had a long-standing relationship with Leclerc, having worked alongside him during the developmental stages of his junior career and throughout his early seasons in Ferrari. Their bond, while never officially declared as problematic, had created a culture where one driver's needs instinctively took precedence over the others. And in a sport where milliseconds define legacies, that imbalance could not be ignored. The subtlety of it was what made it most dangerous. There were no outright exclusions, no dramatic acts of defiance. Instead, there were details, key telemetry data shared a few minutes too late, slight hesitations during high-pressure moments, and setup options communicated with vague suggestions rather than clarity. When Jamiltón compared his pre-race briefing documents to those of Leclerc, the disparities were striking. His sheets lacked granularity. Critical analysis from wind tunnel sessions was abridged. Strategic alternatives were often listed as theoretical, while Leclerc's pages framed them as recommendations. It was not incompetence, it was selective prioritization. The emotional weight of this discovery was not lost on Jamiltón. He had joined Ferrari not just to win, but to inspire change from within, to bring a sense of integrity and equality to a team that had, for decades, been shaped by internal hierarchies. To discover that the very person tasked with guiding him on track was subconsciously, or perhaps consciously, undermining that mission was a deep personal blow. But rather than confront with accusations, Jamiltón chose to escalate strategically. He approached leadership quietly, not with anger, but with evidence. The meeting took place in a closed room in the heart of the Maranello facility, far from cameras and microphones. With a calm but unwavering tone, Jamiltón laid out the inconsistencies. He presented radio transcripts, time-stamped engineering updates, and side-by-side briefings. He did not demand punishment, he demanded transparency. What he asked for was not favoritism in return, but balance. Equal tools, equal access, equal respect. The leadership team, initially caught off guard, responded with what can only be described as cautious acknowledgement. They promised to review processes, to reassign certain oversight responsibilities, and to reinforce protocols meant to ensure parity between both sides of the garage. But Jamiltón knew that words were cheap in Formula One. What mattered was execution. And so, he continued monitoring, documenting, and preparing for the possibility that deeper cultural change might be needed. The weeks that followed were, on the surface, business as usual. But beneath that surface, a quiet storm brewed within Maranello. Luis Jamiltón, ever composed in the public eye, had triggered what many inside the team described as a soft reset. Departmental meetings subtly shifted in tone. Engineers began double-checking their notes, strategists became more inclusive during simulations, and internal memos emphasized parity without naming the source. Yet Jamiltón knew better than to mistake motion for progress. Change, especially in an institution as traditional as FERRARi, was not driven by slogans. It had to be earned, observed, and protected. One revealing moment came during a simulator session in mid-May. Historically, these sessions had leaned heavily on feedback from LECLER, whose driving style the engineers claimed was more in sync with the team's software models. But this time, Jamiltón was given equal, if not more, runtime. When he requested a complex series of alternate setups, expecting delay or resistance, he was surprised to find his team not only prepared but highly attentive. And the results? His feedback led to a measurable improvement in vehicle balance simulations, a detail noted quietly in the engineering logs but not promoted in the media releases. But not everyone welcomed this shift. Within the garage, murmurs began to spread. Some viewed Jamiltón's actions as disruptive, a challenge to the natural hierarchy that had kept the team stable through its highs and lows. Others, particularly younger engineers and performance analysts, saw in him a rare force of accountability. One junior aerodynamicist even remarked, off the record, that Jamiltón had done more to modernize our operations in 3 months than most people manage in 3 years. That comment, though never officially acknowledged, was shared privately between departments, and it spread. The cultural divide was becoming clearer. It was no longer just about Jamiltón and LECLER, but about two philosophies, one rooted in legacy and comfort, and the other in performance and transparency. Jamiltón's insistence on fairness was not just exposing cracks in operational conduct. It was threatening long-standing alliances, shaking internal loyalties, and pushing FERRARi toward a level of introspection it had not faced in years. In the weeks that followed, Luis Jamiltón began to notice something different, not just in how the team operated, but in how certain individuals interacted with him. Where once there had been cool politeness, now there was cautious respect. And in some cases, quiet admiration. Engineers who had previously kept their distance were now more open, more curious, even collaborative. One telemetry analyst, in a rare moment of candor, admitted to Jamiltón that his meticulous approach had revealed inefficiencies they had ignored for too long. The admission was small, but it symbolized a broader shift. Walls were beginning to come down. Still, not all signs pointed to progress. There remained an unspoken resistance among key senior figures who saw Jamiltón's push for equality as an affront to their long-standing systems. These were not people who opposed him openly, but rather those who operated through omission, who continued to delay key decisions or omit critical pieces of information during debriefs. One such incident involved a thermal degradation report that had been circulated internally, but not passed to Jamiltón until after he directly requested it. When confronted, the responsible party cited an oversight. But Jamiltón, ever precise, logged the time discrepancy and flagged it to team leadership. It was not about assigning blame. It was about documenting patterns. Meanwhile, the dynamic between Jamiltón and his race engineer had become increasingly tense. On paper, their communication was professional, but behind the scenes, it was cold and mechanical. Gone was the natural rhythm that exists between a driver and the voice in their ear. Instead, every exchange was measured, rehearsed, and at times distant. Jamiltón had raised the issue quietly with the team principal, suggesting a possible reassignment, or at least the inclusion of a secondary strategist in his loop. The suggestion was noted, but no change came. The loyalty between the engineer and LECLER remained a silent but powerful force within the garage. Rather than confront the engineer directly, Jamiltón continued to focus on performance. He expanded his involvement in simulator work, conducted additional debriefs with factory personnel, and even reviewed race archives to identify how communication trends had evolved over the years. He was not just uncovering a flaw in the present system. He was unraveling years of habit and hierarchy that had quietly dictated who received what level of support. And with every new finding, he added to a growing body of evidence, one that painted a clear picture of imbalance, not malice. What set Luis Jamiltón apart in this quiet war for fairness was not his fame or his reputation. It was his discipline. While many in his position would have gone public, chosen to confront the injustice with headlines and noise, Jamiltón chose precision. He understood that in a team as steeped in legacy as Ferrari, change demanded more than emotion. It required undeniable truth. That truth came in the form of data. He began personally reviewing telemetry from both sides of the garage, cross-referencing his own feedback with that of LECLER. What he found was telling. In multiple instances, despite requesting the same aerodynamic configurations, his requests had been implemented with slight alterations. Subtle differences in wing angle, brake bias, or fuel mapping that skewed the results just enough to favor one car's development trajectory over the other. When Jamiltón brought these findings to the engineering leads, he presented them not with accusation, but with a question. Can you explain why? The room reportedly fell silent. There was no immediate answer. Some blamed calibration differences. Others suggested miscommunication. But to Jamiltón, it was clear. The system had not been built with two equal priorities in mind. Even more concerning, the documentation trail showed that such discrepancies were rarely flagged or reviewed. They were simply accepted. Another sign of an internal culture that had learned to protect the status quo, even at the expense of excellence. Outside the factory, whispers began to spread. In the paddock and among technical journalists, subtle mentions of Jamiltón's influence surfaced. Analysts noted the increased sharpness in his setup runs. Former team members described him as obsessively detailed but impossible to ignore. One former Ferrari strategist even hinted that Jamiltón was forcing the red machine to look in a mirror it had avoided for years. These remarks, though unofficial, signaled a shift in perception. The narrative was no longer about whether Jamiltón could adapt to Ferrari. It was about whether Ferrari could evolve fast enough to keep up with Jamiltón. Behind closed doors, the internal conversation shifted. The team principal began holding more frequent alignment meetings between both sides of the garage. Leadership started pushing for cross-analysis of strategies to ensure consistency. And although LECLER remained the team's emotional centerpiece, there was no denying that Jamiltón had forced a new kind of accountability into the system. Whether it would last remained to be seen, but for the first time in a long time, the balance of power was no longer unspoken. It was being challenged, measured, and recorded. As Luis Jamiltón continued to push for internal equity, the consequences of his efforts became more visible, not just in meeting rooms or data logs, but in the energy that permeated the entire organization. One striking example occurred during a technical workshop at the Ferrari facility in Medina, where engineers from both driver units were brought together to discuss brake integration and energy recovery systems. Historically, such sessions were passive events, routine discussions often dominated by the engineers aligned with LECLER. But this time, Jamiltón arrived early, came prepared with annotated data sheets, and asked specific, layered questions that challenged assumptions. The younger staff in the room were electrified. Here was a 7-time world champion not giving a lecture, but asking for accountability and pushing for better answers. His presence transformed what had often been a stagnant formality into a serious performance review. By the end of the session, several procedural inconsistencies were uncovered. Minor things that had gone unreported for months, but added up to significant performance variation when replicated across a season. These were not mistakes, they were systemic lapses, overlooked because nobody had dared to inspect them with such granularity. Until now. But this new era of scrutiny came with backlash. A few longtime insiders grew increasingly vocal behind the scenes. They accused Jamiltón of disrupting harmony, of weaponizing data, even of sowing division in a team known for its romantic unity. One senior engineer, under the veil of anonymity, described his presence as a scalpel in a kitchen, suggesting that while his methods were surgically precise, they were also painful to the team's traditional rhythms. To this, Jamiltón had no public response. Instead, he continued showing up earlier, staying later, and making sure no detail was left to subjective interpretation. Outside Maranello, motorsport analysts began to speculate. Technical commentators noted how the car's development path had slightly adjusted, no longer based solely on simulations run around LECLER's input, but now factoring in Jamiltón's unique cornering feedback and tire management patterns. Subtle but real. The simulator team, which had previously prioritized setups that mimicked LECLER's style, was now adapting to a broader driving model, one that combined agility with control, a trademark of Jamiltón's philosophy. It was as though the car itself was being forced to evolve, not just for the team's vision, but for Jamiltón's presence. In the broader cultural landscape, this transformation was stirring discussion. Veteran drivers commented on how rare it was for someone at Jamilton's level to challenge an institution from within. He was not just racing, he was reforming. Not by demanding headlines, but by requiring evidence. In doing so, he had exposed a truth long ignored. That the most dangerous kind of favoritism is the one no one questions, because it hides beneath routine. And now, with every session, with every dataset, Luis Jamilton was ensuring that routine could no longer be mistaken for fairness. The internal transformation driven by Luis Jamilton was no longer subtle. It had become a silent storm within the walls of Maranello. Though official press releases spoke only of development synergy and enhanced collaboration, behind closed doors, the team was undergoing a cultural reckoning. The once unquestioned authority of engineers who had long favored LECLER was being interrogated, not by force, but by the consistent exposure of inconsistencies and neglected standards. One particularly revealing moment came when Jamilton requested a full audit of component distribution throughout the season. Not to accuse, but to clarify. The findings were unsettling. Certain parts with marginally lower tolerances, particularly within the suspension and ERS cooling systems, had been repeatedly routed to his garage under the guise of equivalent performance. On paper, the differences were small, but in Formula One, margins are everything. Rather than explode in outrage, Jamilton compiled the results, presented them calmly to senior management, and asked one question. Would you accept this if our roles were reversed? The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. The strength of his argument lay not in drama, but in reason. From that day, a quiet review process began, internally known as the Standardization Initiative, to reevaluate how parts were allocated and how internal performance assessments were communicated. Though never publicly credited to Jamilton, everyone inside the garage knew who had sparked the reform. Meanwhile, LECLER, aware of the growing shift, began to feel the ripple effects. Though still the team's emotional figurehead, his debriefs were no longer taken as gospel. Engineers now cross-checked his feedback with Jamilton's telemetry. Strategy sessions became more balanced. Some in LECLER's camp felt threatened, even betrayed by the changes. Tensions rose. There were moments in the garage when eye contact between the two camps became rare. And while Jamilton never made public remarks about the dynamic, his actions were resolute. Transparency was not optional. It was the new minimum. What made this entire evolution so profound was that it came not from a formal policy or a leadership edict, but from one man's refusal to accept less than truth. Jamilton had not only uncovered the bias embedded in Ferrari's internal processes, he had forced the team to reckon with it. And perhaps most impressively, he did so without scandal, without a single public accusation. His method was quiet, clinical, and relentless. Outside the team, this internal drama remained invisible to most fans. But within the F1 community, whispers became louder. Was this the beginning of a new Ferrari? Or was the old guard simply being outmaneuvered by the very driver they had underestimated? Whatever the case, one thing was now indisputable. Luis Jamilton was not just a driver, he was a catalyst. And the system that had once tried to bend him was now being bent, quietly but unmistakably, in his direction. By the time whispers turned into conversations and conversations into headlines, Luis Jamilton had already moved on to his next battle. Because for him, this was never just about an engineer's misstep or a slightly misaligned strategy call. It was about legacy, not the kind measured in trophies, but the one etched into the culture of a team, the one that reshapes how fairness, merit, and respect are defined within the world's most elite motorsport institution. While the surface of Ferrari remained polished, its history revered and its brand sacred, beneath that surface, Jamilton had caused an irreversible shift. He had demanded a level of honesty and accuracy that could no longer be ignored, and in doing so, revealed that even the most iconic organizations could suffer from institutional complacency. Behind closed doors, senior personnel were divided. Some viewed Jamilton as a necessary disruption, a force that had exposed inefficiencies no one else dared to confront. Others, more traditional in mindset, saw him as a threat to the emotional glue that held the team's romantic identity together. And yet, the results spoke louder than opinions. Internal data reliability had improved. Decision-making had become more data-led, and component quality control had reached unprecedented levels. Even driver feedback integration, once dominated by LECLER's style, was now a balanced, dual-input system, acknowledging that elite performance demands more than favoritism. It requires perspective. Still, Jamilton never asked for credit. In media appearances, he remained diplomatic, often pivoting away from questions about internal politics with that now signature calm. But within the paddock, his reputation had changed. He was no longer just the champion who joined Ferrari for a final chapter. He was the driver who had quietly rewritten its rules. Engineers who once downplayed his feedback now requested one-on-one sessions. Junior staff who had felt invisible found in him a quiet advocate. And fans who had once feared he would fade into ceremonial status now realized he had become the most active disruptor in a team bound by its past. In the end, Jamiltón had uncovered more than the truth behind an engineer's silence. He had exposed the comfort zones within a legendary institution and dared to challenge them with precision and patience. And though his journey with Ferrari was far from over, one thing had become undeniably clear. This was not the story of a fading star, but of a man unafraid to dismantle legacy in order to build something better. Something fairer. Something future-proof. That is the final page of the 8-page script. If you would like, I can now craft a controversial hook that encapsulates this narrative and drives engagement. Just let me know.